Indictment Day. We'll take a look at the Mueller probe and see what may be next.
And Meet Virginia, a deep dive into the Virginia governor's race next Tuesday.
And ambush aftermath, what the ambush in Niger means for the U.S. military action. Welcome to NightCAP. It's November 2nd.
Time for your weekly dose of commentary, analysis, and politics.
I'm Fallon Gallagher.
And I'm James Duran.
And tonight we're joined by Molly Levitt and Chris Crouch. Now, before we dig into this, I want to get everybody on the same page here. Here's what happened this week in the Mueller probe. Special counsel Robert Mueller released his first set of indictments on Monday. Former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort and his associate Rick Gates were charged with conspiracy and money laundering, among other things. Both have pled not guilty. The real surprise, though, came with a new name, George Papadopoulos, a former foreign policy advisor to the campaign. The lower-level staffer took a plea deal admitting that he had been lying to federal investigators. And where was the president during these charges? The Washington Post reports that he was upstairs at home with the TV on, shocking, fuming, which we got a hint of when he tweeted, quote, "Also, there is no collusion," in all caps.
Yeah, so I think a few things are pretty evident here. First of all, from reading that document that the special counsel put out, they are not messing around here. The depth of the charges that they listed for Paul Manafort in particular should be a warning sign to anyone who's even close to this, given the depth that they've gone into. I think the second thing is that that new name, George Papadopoulos, if I'm saying that right, Chicago guy, is the real story here. I think Paul Manafort, we all knew, was already sort of a bad guy, and the crime he committed recently was mostly just being in the public eye. The third, I think, is this is just the beginning. This is all they've chosen to unseal. We don't know who else has been brought in, whether Flynn was brought in, whether Jared has been brought in, whether anyone has sort of cooperated already. We don't know. So this is really just the beginning, and Mueller's team said just as much in media appearances this week.
So when I was speculating this weekend, I was putting money on Manafort. I know my mom was thinking it would be Flynn, and it also could have been Jared. What did you guys all think? Who do you think it was going to be? Were you surprised, Molly? What did you think?
I mean, honestly, at this point, there are so many curveballs happening with this whole investigation that you really never know who it's going to be. I mean, George Papadopoulos, obviously it's a new name, but for people who've been following this for a long time, I mean, there are so many new characters popping up. I mean, between Manafort, Stone, all those people from the beginning, we knew these were shady characters. So this entire thing, it's pretty clear that they're all, pretty shady.
Who do you think it was going to be, Chris?
Well, I'm not familiar with many of the characters in the story, but the problem that I'm seeing is more and more names keep showing up, and that's concerning. It's unclear how, as more and more names come up in the story, how much closer they get to President Trump and figuring out exactly his level of involvement, if any at all. So that's kind of what I want to keep looking out for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good point. And collusion has really been the buzzword. It's not a term that's actually has any basis in the law. It's more of a buzzword that's been thrown around. But in terms of collusion, that baseline thing that Democrats have been trying to prove, that everyone's been talking about, is this Papadopoulos charge by itself enough of a smoking gun in terms of that sort of two-way coordination that I guess you might define collusion as?
I mean, look, if Papadopoulos isn't enough of a smoking gun, I mean, we've in the past with the initial emails that we saw with everyone else, it's pretty clear that it's been collusion, and I think what's going to have to happen is there's just going to need to be more and more evidence that confirms what we already know, basically. So it's pretty hard to say at this point.
And what do you guys think is more significant? Do we think it's the charges against Manafort and Gates, or do we think it's the Papadopoulos plea?
Well, with the Papadopoulos plea, what's concerning is that he admitted to lying to investigators, and that's something we haven't seen from Manafort or Gates. They both have pled not guilty, so that's something new coming up out of this.
Yeah, I think the first guilty plea is important. I think it's a sign, as we talked about, in terms of where we go from here. I mean, we don't know what sort of deal was struck with him. We don't know what cooperation he was given. We don't know if he's even aware of any further activity. But a Politico piece sort of touched on that this week, interviewed a few experts, and so the conclusions of a lot of these experts, I mean, you had sort of the classic Alan Dershowitz take, which is this isn't that big of a deal, we don't know anything yet. Sort of like Jonathan Turley, same thing. But I think others have indicated that this Papadopoulos charge is really significant, that the fact that Manafort, that sort of the detail that I mentioned earlier of how in-depth they're getting in terms of sort of laying out the facts so that there's no dispute over basic facts at trial. I mean, I think there really should be a lot of concern. If you are anyone, I mean, we've heard folks say this before, if you're anyone who was with that campaign in any capacity, you should really be considering getting an attorney at this point. I mean, is that a fair read? Do you guys think it's as serious as I do?
Yeah, definitely as more and more people get involved, like everyone in that campaign has to evaluate what their involvement, if any, in this situation was, how they can protect themselves, and I think we're going to start seeing that come up.
Yeah, absolutely. So now we're going to go to a segment we call Two Trumps Up, where we hear the voices of Trump supporters. Fallon, you wanted to take it from here?
Well, you know me, I'm the biggest Trump supporter around, so.
Well, so sorry, folks. We had planned to speak with a relative of mine, but who's an ardent Trump supporter. We had a bit of technical difficulties. But when I was talking to her earlier today, really a few things stuck out to me that she's interpreting from all this. So for her, a lot of the problems for her was that with Paul Manafort, all those charges really occurred before the campaign started, right? They're talking about charges that he is allegedly, guilty of 10, 20 years in the past, right? The Ukrainian situation happened way before Trump, and so it's hard to imagine, I think, for us that someone can look at this and not think it's super serious. But I think we have to consider that. I mean, Chris, when you talk to folks who maybe are less opposed to the president's agenda, is that something that you hear that maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit?
Definitely, that's definitely the feeling of people I speak to, that there isn't any fully substantiated claim, and what's really unclear when I think a lot of people's mind, and I think people are hesitant to address, is the president's involved, president's direct involvement in anything that happened, and that still needs to be fleshed out and brought to light.
Well, before we move on here, I just want to wrap this up. There was actually, I think it was the title of a Politico piece this week. Where do we go from here? What do we think is going to happen next with this whole Mueller investigation? We've seen, obviously, a lot of new developments happen this week. What's next? Do we think it's Flynn? Do we think it's Jared? Do we think the impeachment word?
I mean, we saw plenty with Jared this summer, and his clear connection to Russia, and I don't know, I mean, at this point, like what you mentioned, that even if it's unclear whether Trump himself is actively involved in this collusion, it really shows a clear judgment problem if he's hiring all these people who are such shady characters. And clearly, if he isn't even vetting who's on his campaign, it's a real problem if he's the leader of our free world.
Yeah, and I have a poll here that's out from today that's somewhat interesting. So Bob Mueller, essentially American people's perception of this probe, right? 58% approve of a special counsel at the Justice Department, Bob Mueller, investigating possible ties between the campaign and the Russian government. We don't have those crosstabs, unfortunately, to look at partisanship, but I think 58%, that seems to be a bit of an uptick. It seems like, the tone is certainly getting there. And, when we talk to folks who are more, closely aligned with the president's agenda, obviously they're in that 42%. But really, I think if this week is any indication of what's to come, then certainly I think you're going to see that number continue to go up.
Well, we have to take a quick break right now, but when we come back, think that Virginia's governor election doesn't matter for you? Well, we want you to think again. We'll be right back after the break.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
So I want to talk a little bit about this Virginia governor's race. Before we get into that in depth, though, I think it's important to touch on two other big races that are happening. So we have the New Jersey governor's race, and we have a Utah special election to replace Jason Chaffetz. So in New Jersey, really, this, I think, when you look at it, is not what people are going to be looking at next week. We have a Monmouth poll out just yesterday indicating that Phil Murphy is as a 14-point lead, and this has been consistent throughout. And so there shouldn't really be any surprises there. I think even folks like Tim Kaine, who you're going to hear a little bit about later, are admitting that this is not really an indicator of national politics of 2018, given the sort of baggage that Chris Christie's accrued. And of course, the Republican candidate in that race is Chris Christie's lieutenant governor. So she is accountable for a lot of that. So I think when even Democrats are admitting that that's not the most important race, we really do need to turn our attention to Virginia rather. And then just to button this up, the Utah special election, as you might expect, is predicted to stay in Republican hands. We're expected to see John Curtis, who's the mayor of Provo, blow out Kathy Allen, the Democrat, as well as a Utah third-party candidate. As we go to Virginia, Fallon.
Well, so this Virginia one is pretty big. Virginians will vote for a new governor this week, and you're probably thinking, we're in Illinois, why does this matter to me? This race is the first major statewide election since 2016, and it's absolutely sure to be a referendum on both political parties. Now, this race has boiled down to Republican Ed Gillespie, who nearly lost his primary, and current Lieutenant Governor Ralph Northam. So until now, Northam had a comfortable lead, but now the polls are closing in and the race is getting ugly. Both parties are desperate for a win. We're starting to see this in a lot of the ads. So we actually have a couple of those ads right now. Let's take a quick look.
Last year, Terry McAuliffe and Ralph Northam instituted the automatic restoration of rights for violent felons and sex offenders, making it easier for them to obtain firearms and allowing them to serve on juries. One of these felons, John Bowen, had his rights restored 2 months after being found with one of the largest child pornography collections in Virginia's history. 43 prosecutors, Republicans, Democrats, and independents opposed Ralph Northam's reckless policy.
All right, so with that of course was an ad from the Latino Victory Fund, which has been fairly controversial and was recently pulled. Sort of a situation where it was actually a small buy. So not many people have seen this on TV, but you might say that that's a PAC, right? You might say that that's not the Northam campaign. Hold that thought. This ad right here is from the Northam campaign. This is a mailer, rather, that was sent out about a week and a half ago. And I mean, once again, I think most of us were blown away to see this. I mean, Fallon mentioned Ed Gillespie almost lost in the primary to a guy named Corey Stewart. This is a mailer that we would expect to see Ed Corey Stewart held on in that primary. Unfortunately, Democrats decided this is still the playbook. Ed Gillespie is certainly not a guy who is aligned with the sort of things that we saw in Charlottesville a couple weeks ago. But, I really want to, in addition to this negative tone, I want to touch on a few other things. We had a couple of weeks ago, and I think really this is the reason why this mailer probably seemed necessary to the Northam campaign. You had Trump sort of stepping all over Ed Gillespie's message with those tweets saying, Ed Gillespie's a great guy, and then his attempt to try and list off reasons why he'd be a good governor essentially were exclusively the fact that he would preserve the Confederate statues. That was the only thing that Trump could come up with for that tweet. So that kind of explains why we're seeing some of these things come up. But for more on that, we're actually going to go to Fallon, you have someone we're going to go to for this.
I do. So you mentioned Charlottesville. We're very lucky because we actually have NNN's Isabel Lawrence, who's been reporting from Charlottesville for the past few months. So we actually talked to her earlier this afternoon.
So you've been in Charlottesville for almost 2 months now. How have you seen this race change?
When I came, the race seemed fairly tight, only a few points between Gillespie and Northam, with Northam in the lead most often, sometimes getting closer, but usually anywhere from a 3 to 5 point lead. But In more recent weeks, you've definitely seen Northam kind of pull ahead a little bit. Again, in my opinion, this could probably be contributed to a reflection on August 12th events and everything that's been happening here in Virginia and the events over the summer. But as far as I have been seeing, definitely a bit of a pull for Northam.
And talk a little bit about the ads we've seen. I mean, I know you mentioned that, we've seen Northam pull away a little bit, but I think in general, we've seen his campaign be a little bit defensive. Some of the ads that they've put out, as well as Gillespie, going back to that attack ad on the MS-13 issue. What have you been seeing in terms of who's winning that ad war?
These ads have definitely added to a lot of attention here. It started out as a fairly clean race, but recently more of these types of ads have been putting out, which have been really quite controversial. But I think those ads are definitely starting to sway people and really starting to affect hearts and minds here, especially in Charlottesville, that's been so deeply impacted by these events.
And switching gears, you spoke recently to Senator Tim Kaine, who was actually used to be the governor of Virginia himself. So how desperate do you think Democrats are for a win here after they were routed in 4 out of 4 of those special elections?
He really made a point that Democrats needed to get out there strong, continue with their volunteer efforts, continue canvassing, and make those cold calls, and really just get everybody to turn out so that they don't lose this to Gillespie, who, despite being behind, is only behind by a few points in the latest polls. And again, that margin of error is only about 3 to 4 points, and the lead is only about 4 to 5. So Kaine really emphasized that it's going to be a close race, that the way Virginia votes could really have an influence on the tone and the mood for the rest of the country. He said that all eyes are going to be on Virginia. In his opinion, Senator Kaine said that the way the New Jersey vote turns out will really just be a referendum on years of Chris Christie rather than the national political climate. And he said that Virginia is really going to be kind of a temperature taker to see where the general public lies, and could be a morale booster for a certain political party going forward.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Isabel.
Thank you.
Isabel with that very comprehensive report. That's a lot to unpack. So Molly, what are your initial reactions to what Isabel said?
So I think this conversation about this race being a referendum on the national conversation is a little problematic, because we heard this exact same rhetoric surrounding the Georgia 6th election this summer. And I think putting all the Democratic Party's eggs in one basket, so to speak, is not good for the party, and I think that especially not good for morale. So I think we have to remember that, Virginia is one state out of many, out of 50. So it's really important to understand that this is not necessarily a referendum on the national conversation.
Well, now I want to take a look at some quick polling. So as we've seen, Northam has always been in control of this race. You can see it in this first poll. But if we look at this next one, we can see that it's kind of all over the place in the last month now. James, you've got some thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think you've seen certainly the overwhelmingly that the polls have been in Ralph Northam's favor. Now, in this last month, we're going to go to a new graphic. I know Fallon just showed you one where things are sort of all over the place in the last few days. But if we go to a graphic where we filter out some polls, I'm going to explain why we take some out. But I think first thing you should notice is just how much clearer this picture is, except for that one blip in the middle, which is a really reputable Monmouth poll that showed Gillespie up 1 a couple of weeks ago, which his campaign, everybody were talking about. So what we did here, this is not a hard and fast rule. In Virginia, however, the voter file is fairly reliable, which means that voter file based sampling is going to be preferable. And when you actually look at the outlier polls, the ones that showed Northam plus 17, Northam plus 15, Northam plus 20, all of those were random digit dialing, which is the other method that the pollsters opt for. So when we take those out, that takes out a lot of the variance. The second thing we do is we eliminate a poll from Kellyanne Conway's former polling firm, which is Republican aligned and frankly doesn't have a verifiable track record. Certainly they're good pollsters, but when we looked at the sample, it was a little bit favorable to Republicans. They had essentially 42-41 Republican, and the reality is much lower in terms of definite Republican self-identifying voters. So you might say that differential is close enough, but we looked at it a little bit further, and this is not a good sample of Virginia electorate. So the last thing was that they had the Attorney General race tied, and there is every other poll indicates that this is going to be a blowout for the Democrat in that race. So a couple reasons why we take that one out. That leaves us with 9. We've got 2 from the Washington Post, 2 from Christian Newport University, 1 Emerson, 1 Roanoke College, 1 Monmouth. That's that Gillespie plus 1, and 1 Fox News poll, which for those of you smirking at home is actually a very reputable and solid polling department. So personally, this reminds me a lot of the last few weeks of the Georgia 6. I know you pointed out we shouldn't really focus in on each election as quite as much, but you had a Democrat in pole position for most of the race with money pouring in from around the country and an unexciting establishment Republican candidate riding momentum a little bit toward the end. Like Ossoff, you have Northam playing defense in the final stretch. The difference, of course, being that Karen Handel actually started to take the lead in quite a few polls at the end, whereas we have not seen that from Ed Gillespie. So I'm looking to see if Ed Gillespie can take the lead in any of these in the last few days. The other thing to consider, of course, is that Ralph Northam has really been dominating, by all accounts, the absentee voting, which has been going on for almost a month. So we'll see how that plays out down the line, but I think this is a pretty clear picture that Northam is still in control. So Molly, what does it mean for Democrats? I know you don't want us to focus on one race, but if we look at all the races since Trump was elected, if they lose this one somehow, which of course would be unlikely, that would be 0 for 5 since Trump was elected. I mean, what does that mean for Democrats if the best they can do is another moral victory, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that what we're seeing right now is a lot of organizations, both nonprofits and like tech companies. There's a new company right now called Mobilize America, and they're really working on getting Democrats to focus on down ballot initiatives or elections like this one. And I think that's really important. In past years, the Democratic establishment has focused mostly on presidential elections. And this pivot towards state elections, local elections is really important and something that's going to take some time, but I think is going to be effective for this Virginia governor's race.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, I mean, from your point of view, I mean, does this look like they're putting the pieces together for 2018? I mean, if they only, let's say, hang on to New Jersey, is that something that, is there any sign that they're going to figure this out by 2018?
Well, I think more thinking on the Republican side, what's interesting about this story to me is how like Republicans were figuring out whether or not it was worth it to bring Trump in to support this campaign. Right. That's how like hostile this has become. We'll see if Trump wants to run again in 2018 or 2020, but yeah, we'll see if that
sure.
that comes through. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely a tough call. Fallon, got a quick prediction for us?
Oh, do I have a quick prediction?
Yeah, sure.
I don't know if I can give my prediction. I'm a journalist. Molly, what's your quick prediction? Real quick.
I think that Northam's going to win.
Chris?
What do you think?
It's looking that way.
All right. After the break, we'll talk Niger.
And if you're enjoying the conversation, follow along on social media for more at NightCAP NU. We'll be right back.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
Welcome back. Moving over to North Africa now, let's talk a little bit about Niger. As we know, 4 American servicemen were killed in an ambush. Trump received backlash after a condolence call to one of the widows. And a few weeks later, many questions remain unanswered, like what were U.S. troops doing in Niger in the first place? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think certainly Trump's conduct since that call leaked has not been something that I would ascribe to. But beyond that, I think General Kelly and that back and forth with the Congresswoman from Florida. I mean, we don't have time to get into whether or not she should be in the car listening to that call and putting that on social media, but frankly, General Kelly should be the one to stay above the fray on that. And I think the third takeaway from that is really that Trump's cop-out here that, when asked if he authorized the mission, that he has, the best generals, and the generals authorize the mission. They have decision-making authority. Really not what you want to hear from your commander-in-chief. Molly, your reaction to all this?
So even just beyond all the Trump claiming not to know what's happening with his foreign policy, we've seen this for centuries of U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. meddling in other countries, finding out years later about the U.S. helping stage coups, and this is small compared to what we've seen in the past. So
Sure.
I'm frankly not surprised at all that this is happening.
And what's really getting me is that Senators Lindsey Graham and John McCain are both prominent members of the Armed Services Committee. So what does it say about the fact that they were neither fully aware of the scope of military operations in North America? What does that say, Chris?
Well, it's concerning from a leadership perspective in our military that people supposedly in charge are not aware with operations. I think this is microcosmic as a problem that's been in the country, in our country for decades, that the common American doesn't know about this extent of our involvement in military affairs across the world, and that's a problem.
What really got my interest in this one is that it's McCain. And, if we go back to the healthcare debate, McCain was the one who was a no vote because he was so disappointed in the way that the rules were being followed in the Senate. There was no respect for the traditional leadership. And I think that we're seeing this here to a degree with the fact that the Senate and the Senate Armed Services Committee don't know where our troops are. There's no...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're hearing, Rand Paul has been a voice on this for quite some time. You're hearing others, more of a bipartisan tone to this recently, where they're calling for a new authorization for the use of military force, and hopefully they can make some progress on that. I mean, certainly it's not a good scenario in which we're using a 16-year-old AUMF to authorize conflict that had nothing to do with 9/11. So we'll see how that progresses.
Well, now we want to move on to one of our favorite segments. It's called In Case You Missed It, where we each go around and say something interesting that we found in the news this week. So what do you have for us this week, Chris?
Yes, well, Trump and Senate Republicans are considering a bill that, among many other things, would make income on university endowments taxable. So that would be a big hit for universities, how universities are run as nonprofit organizations. That would be a seismic change.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know what that would look like for research. Molly, what do you got for us?
So bringing this back to local news.
Please.
So
Evanston.
Well, yeah, so Evanston State Senator Daniel Biss, who's now running for Illinois governor, has proposed a new bill with his running mate, Letisa Wallace, to instate mandatory sexual harassment training for all the state senators and House representatives, lobbyists, and staffers in Springfield. And I think this is going to bring significant change to the culture of Springfield, which we've seen through various op-eds recently with the whole Me Too phenomenon, that this is one part of a huge conversation that I think is going to help.
Yeah, some shocking news out of Springfield. A lot of incredible accounts that you don't want to be hearing, certainly.
Certainly.
So I've got something this week. So Chris, and we were talking about the World Series earlier, but for me, the highlight of the World Series, great World Series, probably the best, one of the best ever.
Better than last year?
Big Papi.
Better than last year for you?
No. Better than last year as a Cubs fan, because Big Papi was not in the post game last season. Big Papi made my last few weeks of midterms, and this graphic right here I think is great. Big Papi went 0 for 7 predicting the World Series outcomes. So
wow, 0 for 7. What were you? Were you 7 for 7?
That was. I mean, I wasn't really betting on it, but I still take a lot of pleasure in Big Papi. I think that it was like watching the SNL skit, but on live television. I mean, it was great. A-Rod was trying way too hard. Big Papi would come in and say 2 words in Spanish, and everyone would laugh. A-Rod would look dejected. It was great. So that's what I've got this week.
And
more Big Papi, please.
Did you guys like Big Papi as much in the World Series, Molly?
I actually didn't watch the World Series last night because I was at the Obama Foundation community event with Chance the Rapper.
Talk about that. How was that?
It was amazing. At the end, Chance the Rapper and Lin-Manuel Miranda went on together and sang Dear Theodosia. There may or may not have been tears. It was a great time.
Oh my God, that sounds incredible. And
more or less tears than me watching Big Papi.
Honestly, probably fewer. Fewer tears.
Yeah, let's get the grammar right on that one. It's fewer or more.
Because there's multiple tears,
Yeah, you can count those tears.
You can.
Yeah, well, I'll work on that. That's all the time we have, folks. If that wasn't enough of a nightcap for you, it's only 8:30. Plenty of time to keep talking.
And we'll see you next week. Thanks so much for watching.